So, the average person walks 150 million steps in a lifetime. But how many go somewhere new? I'm talking about those first steps, next steps, even missteps. The steps that move us all forward. Those are the ones that count. Let's keep walking.
We live at the speed of life. It can be seen as a series of opportunities. The things we do and places we go are to craft a better tomorrow. Because life is truly what happens between you and your destination. And for those who see the possibilities, there is a Lexus. The luxury you know just became more refined. The new Lexus ES. Refinement crafted.
There are two goals common to all of us: create legacy and achieve growth. What you neglect today might be what matters the most to your loved ones and family members. At Legacy Growth, we help protect your wealth and create structures for asset protection and governance. While everyone needs a basic will, Many families must establish a family trust. Your purpose is our mission, fostering legacy and ushering growth.
Good evening, and thank you for coming back. And I'm going to ask for one more ring of the bell, because I'd love to thank our partners when everybody is sitting here, because it's really their generosity that makes these evenings possible. And I don't want to thank them in absentia. So I'm just going to ask my colleagues to ring the bell again. I hope you enjoyed the last two conversations, and we have another riveting one coming up. Allow me just 2 minutes while everybody comes back. We didn't realize that Delhi is going to be this cold. Taj Mansingh assured us that they're doing outdoor evenings every single day, but suddenly the sort of weather has plummeted. And we also thought that we had written the lawn, but maybe we didn't, because many of you wouldn't have turned up, you know. But I hope you're keeping warm, snug with each other, and the power of the conversations. Don't worry. That's true. Yeah. So, there are a lot of people just walking in. So, Ads, will you just ring the bell a little bit more? So, I really do want to thank Shivnadar Foundation, because right from the word go, it's they who've really made this possible. And as I said earlier, Shivnadar Foundation is really created by the personal wealth of Mr. Shivnadar himself. And it's not even his company wealth. He has put it into the idea of creative philanthropy. And they support a wide range of things, of course, art, habitats, and as I said, the power of conversation, the power of ideas, which really is the heart of education. And they have 7 eminent institutions, colleges, universities, schools, both in Noida, Gurgaon, Chennai. But always the thing that I really like to highlight is that somebody who visited their Vidya Gyan and Shiksha Initiative school said that it was really the kind of Doon school of those who were economically disenfranchised. And that's the quality of education and opportunity that they provide. And they've also created an alumni network. In fact, I'd like to say that they've been creating scholarships and enabling a lot of their students to go to Ivy League colleges. And they are looking for people who will then enable them to get jobs once they leave the Ivy League schools, particularly those who are economically disenfranchised. So if any of you want to reach out to the Shivnadar Foundation to help them in this journey, you know, their colleagues are here, Nikhil, Anshul, all of them are here. So do either reach out to us or to them and help them create that opportunity for everybody. As I said, their core idea is creative philanthropy, and we are very proud to have them as very core partners of Ignition. They're the reason we're able to put this together month on month. So a big round of applause to them. I'd also like to thank those who are actually delaying the evening now with their spirits, which is Johnny Walker. Keep walking, keep walking. You know. I'm just going to again urge my colleagues to get everybody to close the bar and bring everybody back here. But really, each partner that we associate with, there is a commonality of vision. Because this is not so much about the classic corporate world, which is ROI. It's really vision-driven. It's kind of brands that believe in what we are doing. And most importantly, that idea that conversation, reason, dialogue, rational debate really matters to all of us in a society. So very proud to have Johnny Walker as our partners and their idea for inclusive, diverse society. And of course, their wonderful spirits which help us to keep walking even on a cold night. I'd like to thank also Lexus. I hope all of you have showered a lot of love on their car. The NX 370, which is a hybrid car, It's reliable. It's both electric as well as, there's no fear of it running out because their battery runs a very long time. But it's because they also have very luxurious interiors with Tatukame craftsmanship. But again, the reason they've come together with us is because they believe in creating emotional relationships and experiences, and they hope that their car becomes that in your lives. So do reach out to them. Again, all their representatives are here, and whether for a test drive or to buy them. I always say, we have a wonderful jeweler who's a partner in Chennai, and I said, I want to kind of change my career, my husband, my options and my choices to be able to afford the things that our sponsors are bringing to us. If any of you are in a position to do that, do shower your generosity back on them. I'd like to thank DLF. As I said, they're here like a Trojan horse to take Delhi citizens back to Gurgaon, but they are synonymous with 21st century urban living, wonderful residential complexes, offices, and again, they are partnering with us because apart from buildings, they understand that a city and a society needs communities, and communities come, like Yuval Harari is in India, and he said the reason the human race even evolved is because of a desire for stories and for gossip. So us coming together really matters as a community, and we are proud to have DLF backing this. And of course, Legacy Growth, which is advisory company that is headquartered in India but has branches across the world, a global footprint in the US, Canada, UK, Singapore, Dubai. Their co-founders are here today. They help with very bespoke solutions for succession planning, for investments, for business expansion. And they have offered a wonderful opportunity to everybody who's here at Ignition that they'll do consultations for free. Their table is outside, so do reach out to them. Suraj Malik, Anand Jain, and Shweta Kalra, they're all here. And now on that note, I'd again just like to give a quick thank you to the Lucid Lines team and my partner Aditya Puri and the Brand Avatar team and Taj Mansingh for hosting us in this very beautiful, in a polluted sky, this feels for the moment an alcove of wonderfulness. So thank you, Taj Mansingh. And now to the very, very riveting, intellectually challenging, and I would say courageous act of writing a book that challenges a lot of the notions that we live with in a very fraught time. And yet, it's important that these books are written and that they challenge us to change our settled positions, to have intellectual curiosity. And how do we do that without creating new riptides of hatred and enmity and polarization? And that's why this conversation is literally the crown of the evening, because Manu Pillai is that young historian that is willing to say it as it is. He is willing to take on difficult questions, to unearth stories, absolutely riveting characters that makes up this great palimpsest and tapestry that we call India. And yet those histories have some dark shadows, they have dark events, and yet how do we spotlight that in a way, as I said, which creates deeper understanding, more nuanced understanding, and does not lead to new chapters of hate and destruction. That is where he positions his scholarship and his popular writing, and that's what makes it so special to have Manu Pillai here today. Many of you may have read his other books. For me, one of the most wonderful ones was Rebel Sultans, where he literally brought alive the Deccan and the complete array, rainbow array of characters, countries that came together, converged, made tactical alliances, transactional alliances to shape that fabric that we call India. It's full of characters that question every sort of, stereotyped binary that we might want to inhabit. And so really for me, that's one of his most wonderful books. He's also written The Mahatma and the Brahmin and the Italian. Wonderful gift that you must give to anybody because they are wonderful chapters with, again, stories and characters upon whose shoulders history turns. And now he's written a book called Gods, Guns, and Missionaries. And it is about how the encounter with Europe shaped the modern Hindu project. And it is, as I said, a very important conversation, a difficult conversation, and a delicate one. Nobody better than Manu Pillai to have that conversation with us. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Manu Pillai on stage. I'll just ask my colleagues again to close the bar so that everybody comes right back here. And thank you so much for being here, Manu. Manu's official launch is 3 days later. So it's a special thanks that, we reached out to him and he said, yes, Ignition community I want to speak to. So thank you, Manu.
Thanks, Shoma. Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be back after, I think, 2 years.
Yes. Actually, we started Ignition with Manu, so it's triple special now to have you here. So Manu, as I said, Gods, Guns, Missionaries, the title itself is intriguing, challenging, and we're going to dive right into it. But first, in one line, what is it, the elevator pitch, and why in this very difficult atmosphere did you want to take on a book like this and write it?
Well, let's begin with the title itself, right? Gods obviously is a reference to...
Will you speak closer into...
Sorry.
Can everybody hear him?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So gods, of course, is a reference to divinity, but human societies being what they are, obviously had no consensus on God. There were some people who thought God was one, some people thought God was many, some people thought there were millions of gods, that there were 3 gods. It varied. And naturally, as we are a quarreling species, this often led to certain quarrels as well. The other thing is guns, and guns is a reference to colonialism, which again we have a somewhat simplistic idea of typically, which is that these white people came to non-white parts of the world and oppressed everybody morning, afternoon and evening, and that was it. But actually it's a slightly more nuanced story in that the colonizer himself was also a very nervous, anxious kind of character. They themselves were paranoid about what they were doing, and it sparked a lot of questions about themselves and changed their own culture. So it's interesting that it wasn't just them affecting us, we in a strange way ended up affecting them and their sense of self as well. And the final bit is missionaries, because they, as I spotlight in the book, were a very important element in Hindu-ness becoming a political force. People often think of Hindutva and Hindu nationalism through the prism of Hindu-Muslim relations, whereas as I attempt to show in the book, the colonial era was also when Christianity and Western society and Western values came into the picture. And that encounter, that conflict, that resulted in a great way in shaping the modern Hindu identity as well.
So, Manu, after we've unraveled the story, I'm going to come back to the modern moment, but just one quick more question before we dive into the book, is that were you worried while doing this? Were you worried while releasing it? And I've just come out of a bruising experience where, I'm trying to bring this completely polarized left, right, Hindu, we want to create spaces where people can speak, where you can hear yourselves, where you can shift some positions. And it is a difficult task. Now here, into that cauldron, you drop a book which really shows how the missionaries and their sort of structured desire to convert India did end up helping create the Hindutva movement. Were you worried about putting this book out?
I was, because even when I was doing my edits, as I was looking at each chapter, I could tell which one would upset which group. So I was like, this introduction is going to upset the right. The first chapter is going to upset the left. So it was going that way.
Equal opportunity offender.
Yeah, so I also in my mind decided that if I get cancelled comprehensively for this book and my career comes to an end, what will I end up doing? So I was like, okay, I've got decent savings. I could afford life in my ancestral village with some comfort and dignity. So I'll go back to my ancestral village. We have a nice house there. And I can stay there and do something over there. So I did think, that far. And I'm only half kidding in the sense that when you write about complicated things around religion and identity and politics, necessarily your brain does wonder where this will land you up. You might get into trouble. And just this afternoon, in fact, someone forwarded me a nasty email they got about the book, which was a very oversensitive email. You have to really read too many things into it to be that offended by anything. But again, we are also living in a time where, if somebody breathes in the wrong direction, that can offend somebody. Right. So it's just, this is the perils of doing business and doing what I do in this country. But again, I've chosen to be in this trade, which means that if I've made this choice, I have to still do it with sincerity. I have to put my money where my mouth is, and one can't just preach about being courageous and brave. Sometimes even when you're not feeling it, you have to pretend to be it and just go ahead and do it.
Right. I just, on a facetious note, if anybody who follows Manu's wonderful Instagram feed...
You'd bring it up.
You'll know he has an alternate profession. He can become a gym trainer, body trainer, because that's what he does in his real time. history writing is his spare activity. But anyway, Manu, so let's start with the gods aspect of it. It's fascinating in your book, you first lay out what Hinduism was before it encountered either Islam or Christianity. It was, as you describe it, it's like this fabric which has no stitches at the end, you know. And it starts with a wonderful anecdote about Madhav Singh. So share that with the audience and then tell us what was Hinduism before this encounter with quote-unquote other cultures and nations.
So the book begins with the story of the Maharaja of Jaipur, a gentleman called Madhav Singh, who I think came to power in 1880 or so. And in the early 1900s, he was invited to the coronation of the King Emperor in London. Except that, as many of you might know, for good Hindus, for Orthodox Hindus, it was not proper to cross the Kala Pani and go abroad. But throughout history, this is the one thing about our culture, which is that every time you hit these awkward corners between traditional and what you have to do, the traditional always compromises by creating some kind of way to bypass it, which is either ritual, a story, a narrative, something that creates a corridor, and then you can sort of do what you need to do. For example, even something as small as when my father passed away, we were told that every month you have to do certain rituals. And I said, look, I'm not going to be in Kerala constantly on those dates, so what do we do about this? And the priest said, oh, that's okay then, just come back after 1 year, and we'll do all the 12-month pujas in one shot, and we'll do a compensatory 13th month, and that'll be it. So I said, perfect, that worked out. And great, you know, I actually appreciated the fact that we have that flexibility. So Madhav Singh had to go. He called up his Brahmin priests and others and asked them, you know, how is it that I can go to Europe? How can I cross the Kala Pani when it's supposedly bad and I can lose caste? And then they sort of had a discussion, and finally the priests came back and said that, look, you have a deity, Sri Gopalji. It is the deity who's going to London, and as the deity's follower, you are only following the deity to London. So they actually get the deity on a ship. They get Ganga Jal, you know, urns and urns of Ganga Jal. They get cows, because you can't drink the milk of English cows. Those don't count as sacred. Only Indian cows are sacred. So you have to get cows. This entire sort of retinue of a royal retinue from Jaipur sets out in a special train, reaches Bombay, where they do all these rituals, apparently inspired by the Ramayana, where Rama performs these rituals apparently, and then they sort of propitiate the sea god, get onto a ship that nobody's used before, so it's ritually clean, and then they head off to Europe. And even in Europe, when they get off in London, it's always Sri Gopalji who sits in the first carriage, and Madhav Singh sits in the second carriage, because he's still following his deity around. And you know,
and all the cows.
The cows, of course, are there as well, and the Ganga Jal also, because drinking English water was just abhorrent. You couldn't do that. But the thing is, it's funny, it sounds droll, but really it's also amazing that you could get around tradition and ritual norms by being a little creative. But the point you were making, Shoma, about Hinduism itself before Islam or Christianity or the monotheistic faiths came into the picture, was that in many ways it was a composite, it was a conglomerate. So we have, when we think of Western religions, we have the main religion and then sects that branch off, like the Protestant faith, etc. But in Hinduism, it's often the other way around. You have tribal cults, you have movements bubbling up from below, and they sort of coalesce eventually, or they are made to come together through the weaving of threads, through the weaving of a common narrative, and so on. And that's how Hinduism really takes form, which is why in Hinduism, even if, say, a Brahmin does not recognize or appreciate a tribal god who people worship with alcohol and meat, they still won't deny the tribal god. They say, okay, this is a lower god, but the god still has space. There's a way of making room for everybody within this composite system. And as the analogy I use is of a tapestry that's constantly being woven, but the outer edges haven't been made. There's no border, because it's still constantly shifting shape. It's still constantly wearing different faces in different times. But first, of course, there's an encounter with Islam, which is when there's a bit of a defensive impulse that is born, and you see in the writings of Kabir, Eknath, etc., you see a sense of Hindu and Turk, as the word is used, being two separate categories. But the real stitching up of the borders, which is still underway, it's still not a complete process, happens in the colonial period, and that's where Christianity comes into the picture, as the rest of the book explains.
Yeah. So I'm going to come to those, you know, as I said, difficult, complex, contentious issues that you have very bravely actually taken on. But before that, just a little bit again about our understanding of Hinduism. You know, one of the contentious ideas is that, and there's great debate even in our time now, is that was Hinduism really invented? possibly in the 19th century, and it really didn't exist. We didn't understand ourselves as a Hindu country or a Hindu civilization. And that's a big debate, So in all the research that you did, what did you find? And were there internecine battles even between different, I'd say, embroideries in that tapestry of being Hindu?
So, yeah, there was for a long time a sense or a claim that Hinduism was invented in the 19th century because, yes, it's true that it was an Englishman called Charles Grant who in the 18th century even used the word Hinduism for the first time. The word Hindu itself comes out of a foreign language, even though it was later appropriated by Indians. Hinduism first was used by an Indian, and that Indian was Raja Ram Mohan Roy in the 19th century, as far as we know. So in that sense, the word is new. But as I say in the book, just because the name is new doesn't mean the river isn't old. The river is a very old one. It's just that around a bend in its journey, it picked up a new name. Now, another analogy I give is, imagine 4 or 5 brown people in a room, different shades of brown, they're even squabbling with each other. At that point, they don't recognize themselves as necessarily one unit. But a white man enters, and that's when you realize that there's something that differentiates you from the white man. Your brownness becomes a means to articulate a shared identity. That doesn't mean inner contradictions have gone, but the inner contradictions don't mean that the other identity isn't real either. And if the white man is also a bit aggressive, your brownness becomes a way to mount joint action and its joint sense of purpose, etc. And Hinduism, I think it's very clear by the medieval period, already had a sense of self taking form. In the sense that against the Jains, for example, Vaishnavas and Shaivas had a clear sense of some commonalities versus the Jain. So there was a sense that this set of traditions belongs in one camp, some Jainism, Buddhism belong in another camp. So there was a sense of self. You don't necessarily need a name, right? If I'm sitting alone in a room, I'm not going around calling myself Manu because there's no need for me to articulate my identity that way. It's when I come face to face with a Shoma that I have to introduce myself as a Manu, right? That's when my name even becomes necessary. So it's a little bit like that, which is that because Hinduism didn't feel the need to give itself one name, doesn't mean it did not exist. The other thing to also remember is that unlike religions of the book, Hinduism, as I said, did not evolve around one prophet or one tradition. It's a composite. Yet that composite exists in a common framework. Anywhere you go in the country, people know the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, the Puranas. The Puranas are trying very consciously to wed the local with the pan-Indian, to create space for the local to continue to exist, but also be part of a broader sort of narrative. So, Brahmins will find a tribal deity somewhere and they'll say, oh, this is a form of Parvati, and they'll co-opt the tribal deity into the pantheon. The tribal deity continues in many ways in her old style, but at the same time, she's also given a genealogy from the greater narrative. So it's a complicated but interesting process. But Hinduism, I think, was real. It's just that the name came much later.
So just one more moment on the name before we move on to many other things, strands in your book. But, right back in Alexander's time or even earlier, there was an idea of sacred geography. And there was a sense that, the idea of the Sindhu or the Hindus, that it was a geographic identity, that it's a composite region that already existed way back in 300 BC, 350 BC. So, is that accurate?
I mean, we have accounts of people speaking to Alexander and describing their homeland, and by homeland they meant the civilizational sort of space as basically stretching from the Indus to the Bay of Bengal and from the Himalayas to Kanyakumari. So they had a sense that this belonged in one cultural framework, and it is that cultural framework that eventually becomes Hinduism as we know it.
So if you were to describe this Hinduism before the tapestry started to stitch itself into the Hindutva political project, what would be some core, you've said this thing about negotiation, accommodation, some other characteristics which were quintessentially, Hindu before it became Hinduism?
I think the epics, the epics were such an integral part of our identity. You find epics being retold and narrated by different groups in different ways. The core story exists, but it's remarkable how it penetrated every part of the country. There are tribal versions of the Ramayana and Mahabharata, and there are Brahminical versions. There is Tamil version, there's a North Indian Tulsidas version. So constantly the epics kept being circulated and sort of recycled in interesting ways, which meant that people saw that as connecting themselves in some way. The other was the sacred geography, which is that there was a missionary in the 17th century who met, one of these Brahmins in Tamil Nadu, and that the Tamil Brahmin first mentioned all the sacred sites in Tamil Nadu, saying we have Srirangam, Madurai, Rameshwaram, all of those places. But then he also highlights a sacred geography that's more pan-Indian. Kashi, Dwarka, a bunch of other places. Now, the Tamil Brahmin sitting in Tamil Nadu doesn't know the exact geographical location of Kashi. Give him a map and ask him to point it, he won't know. But he knows of the existence of this place because it is in his cultural consciousness, right? So that's the thing. We assume that because Western religions have a certain trajectory, to qualify as a religion, everything must meet that trajectory. That's not true. In different parts of the world, especially in the East, religions have evolved in a different style. So you can't really compare the Western formula with the Indian one and then say that the Indian one therefore doesn't fit the bill. We just need to alter our gaze itself.
So, for the moment, we'll park the encounter with Islam and with, the whole sort of Muslim period of Indian history and jump to this colonial period. A lot of attention really has been on the economic deprivations of what colonialism did to India. But you've dared to take on this idea of the missionary project, So you mentioned Charles Grant, and we'll talk about the different ways that it impacted each other. But interestingly, in your book, you say that even the British world and the East India Company and the government and the Queen, they were all divided into two camps of Indophobia and Indomania, Now, people like Charles Grant and others were part of the Indophobia. So and I'm saying these are acts of courage because I think we should draw a very clear line that post-1947, our project of nationhood is completely different. And we should have the freedom to talk about what went wrong pre-1947 without it impacting our co-citizens of Christians or Muslims, And I want to really put that out because that's the only context in which you can, with a clear eye, look at history. So with that said, talk to us about Charles Grant and Buchanan and, James Mill and people like this. How were they presenting India and what was the missionary project?
So again, as you very correctly and wisely said, missionaries came to the country. Yes, there was a certain amount of attack on Hinduism. But again, this isn't a blame game, right? They came out of a cultural context in which they were operating, and their respondents in India were also coming from a cultural context, and they were responding. So as someone who's studying history, we're not sitting in judgment over these people. We're just trying to understand what happened and what that led to over a period of time. So what you find right at the beginning is that missionaries coming into India came from a culture where there was one God, and that God was essentially defined in a Christian way. And the only path to God was through the Bible. And even as Christianity spread through Europe was also pagan at one point. Europe also had shrines to trees and local gods and all of that. They also had human sacrifice and animal sacrifice and all of that. And they had this sense that idol worship was basically worship of Satan. Anything that was in an idol was not God, that was devil worship, and God was only what Christianity recognized. So that was the bifurcation. So when they came to India, that's what they saw. Anytime they went to a temple, they'd see, say, a Narasimha, and they'd be like, this can't be God. Ripping open somebody, coming out of a pillar, ripping open some other human being. This is not a God. This has to be a devil. There's this wonderful image in the book of, somebody went to Calicut, and they said, the king of Calicut worships a devil called Diomo. And what is this Diomo? It's actually the word Devam, which in Malayalam means Deva or God, which they heard and they were like, this is Diomo or Diomus, the devil of Calicut. And the devil of Calicut is shown with like cock's feet and fangs and sort of these sharp claws and all of that. And there is no such deity in Calicut. Calicut has a Shiva, but that's all. That's it. They saw Sati everywhere. And it became a way to also titillate your audience at home. A lot of European travelers coming here, they had to relate these very outlandish stories because they had an audience at home eager to consume outlandish stories. So often they would claim that across India, all these widows were constantly being burned. And why was Sati created? They gave it their own logic. They said that Indian women were far too lustful, and there was an epidemic where women were constantly poisoning their husbands. And therefore the husbands, to avoid being poisoned, told the women, look, if you poison us and we die, then you'll have to burn. So this was a way of maintaining peace between men and women. That's the origin story that Europeans gave Sati. But they also saw Sati in places where it didn't exist. For example, you have a traveler in Kerala saying that there was Sati in Kerala. Kerala is the one part of India where Sati is outlawed traditionally. Firstly, most of the upper caste communities that would have practiced Sati were matrilineal. In the matrilineal system, if one husband dies, you take the next. That's how it works. You could even have multiple. Right. My great-great-grandmother was married twice. So it's not even a far-off custom. It existed till recent times. Only the Brahmins were patriarchal, and they have a written, what is called their 64 Anacharams of the Nambudiri, supposedly given by Parashurama, specifically says no sati. So then how did this man see sati in Kerala? So there is an exaggeration that exists. Then they came into India and started having debates with the Brahmins. And these debates are fascinating because across India, different parts of the country, North India, South India, coastal India, wherever it is, you find that the Hindus are responding sometimes with very similar arguments. Which is why when you said also, what is it that brought Hinduism together, if not, even if it didn't have a common name? That framework, that way of thinking and arguing back. And for example, the missionaries would come and say that there is only one God. And the Brahmin would say, yes, we agree, there is only one God. And then they were like, okay, the path to God is the Bible. And they would say, no, that we don't agree, because God is like a shopkeeper, and to bring different customers to his table, he has different products. So in your part of the world, he's appeared and given you the Bible. In our part of the world, he took avatars as Vishnu. So different cultures have different paths to God. So you can't generalize and say, this is the only path.
So, just to bring you for a short period to the more uncomfortable aspects of this story, you mentioned Charles Grant, and there was Charles Buchanan, and they are much more vituperative than Claudius Buchanan. They're much more vituperative, It's really like Jagannath in Orissa really came for a lot of opprobrium from them, and they say he's the Moloch of India, that they were eating children, they were sacrificing their widow.
Indian mothers were throwing their babies to crocodiles in rivers.
Right. So, what was the impact of, and there was a big tussle in Britain over whether the missionaries should get a kind of official, sponsorship by the Crown and by East India Company. So talk to us about that, and also what did this, this articulation of Indians and Hindus, what did it do to the Hindu psyche?
So what I just described in the previous answer was what was happening earlier, before the British period. So at this time, these debates are largely academic because they're happening in Hindu courts in front of Hindu rajas, and these missionaries are coming in. The political scales are still even. There's no tilting of the scale. So the Hindus are just amused at this point with the missionaries. There's some irritation, but broadly there isn't much of a political response because politics is still in the hands of Hindu rulers. Through the 18th century, as British power increases, this starts shifting. You start seeing that power is falling into the hands of the white man. And this is where naturally the ruled Indians or the Hindus in India, they start to feel a certain anxiety because now the table has started to lean in one direction. Now, this is the interesting thing about colonialism. Initially, the British, for the longest time, for several generations, did not want missionaries in the country. This was a time when Englishmen were so nervous about being in India. They had conquered kingdoms, but they had no guarantee they could hold on to it. So they felt that they had to cultivate the loyalty of Indians and Hindus. And in order to cultivate the loyalty of Hindus, you have to respect their religion. So when they actually go into Puri and conquer Puri for the first time, they go out of their way to respect Jagannath. The priests of Puri write a Sanskrit letter praising the Governor General, saying that, oh, actually it's great that the East India Company came because under our previous Hindu rulers we were suffering. We're glad you came, and we hope Puri continues forever under the British Raj. So that's the attitude that exists. So they're smashing coconuts. The Englishmen are smashing coconuts at temples. They're participating in temple festivals. Donations. In Tirupati, Thomas Munro gives a donation. In the Padmanabha Swami temple in Trivandrum, Colonel Munro gives a silver umbrella with emeralds hanging on it and all of that. So there's active sort of cultivation of Hindu, loyalty on the part of the British. What happens is changes in Britain itself. Always when we think of colonialism, we have to look at what's happening in India, but also what is happening in Britain. After the Industrial Revolution, there are lots of social changes happening in Britain. With modernization coming in Britain, power structures are failing. Lots of things are happening in British society. As a result of that, there's a soul-searching in British society, and there's a growth of religiosity. The Enlightenment was all about rationalism, reason, and as a backlash, there was a kind of religiosity. In some ways, we're seeing that in our country, right? Which is that post-independence Nehruvian secularism eventually triggers a backlash in the form of the political forces that are now in the ascendant.
And also very interestingly, you talk about this whole clash between Catholicism and Protestants, so in addition to the Industrial Revolution.
This image I love because that's a Brahmin priest blessing the flag of the East India Company from this phase when they were all pretty pally with each other. But yes, so what happens is After this evangelical movement begins in Britain, suddenly there's a lot of public pressure in Britain to go out and civilize the natives. So in England, there are now petitions being sent to Parliament saying, how can the British government take care of thousands of temples? How can British soldiers who are Christians participate in festivals of Hindu gods and escort Hindu gods on their ritual baths, menstrual baths, their processions and all of that? These are not things Christians should be doing. And a new generation of Englishmen who are raised in this climate start coming into India, and suddenly the smashing of coconuts stops. Suddenly the participation in Hindu rites stops. This is when Hindus start getting agitated, because so far as the Englishman was respectful of local culture, it was acceptable to some degree to live under their control, because at least cultural attributes were left alone, religion was left alone. Now there was contempt. There was clear contempt that, oh, this is not a true religion. This is just devil worship and idolatry, and therefore there must be conversion. And at this point, missionaries are also waging an argument in Britain to come into India. 1813, they win one victory, which allows them access to India. But local guys get to decide where missionaries can go. By the 1830s, missionaries have full access to India. Now they're preaching at melas, they're preaching outside temples, they're visible in a very serious way. And this is also the time when the East India Company is annexing Awadh, it's annexing Hindu kingdoms, Jhansi, all of these things are happening. So Hindu society feels that it is very much under siege. If the British government are toppling Rajas who are not just kings, but also cultural icons and protectors of religion, the missionaries are visible in a very serious way. This is when that defensive impulse in many ways becomes sharper and sharper and sharper, culminating ultimately in Hindutva.
So, if one is this in terms of religion, and then of course we all know about Macaulay and his famous statement, but there were many others in that stream who also then really denigrated and degraded the entire intellectual history of, Hinduism and of the different facets of Hinduism at that point. So interestingly, Manu, you say that there was a lot of conversion going on at this point. The missionaries had access. There was great anxiety in Hindu society now. And that's when Hindu society starts to sort of cohere into one monolithic thing. And also
politically,
and also to reinvent itself almost like a Protestant Hinduism, Help us understand that phrase. What does it mean by that it reinvented itself now as Protestant Hinduism? And how did the reform movements in Hinduism get impacted by colonialism?
So you have to often look for the clues as to how people are responding and resisting, right? So one story I found very amusing was how Hindus came up with their own explanation of why Christianity exists in the world. Because now you're confronted with Christianity, you have to find some way of explaining why it's there and why it's becoming dominant. So one interesting story has it, this is from the 19th century, where they say that, Hinduism, Shaivism, Vaishnavism, etc. were doing so well, that the Hindus were so uplifted by God, that heaven was getting overpopulated and hell was getting depopulated. And this was upsetting the cosmic balance. And in order to restore cosmic balance, God created Christianity. So some of these souls would be waylaid into hell. And then, hell would also have enough of a population in it. So it's a negative story, but it's a way of placing the Christian and Christianity into the Hindus' framework in a negative sense. Then you have other cases where the Ram Leela performances are done, right? Where finally you shoot an arrow, a burning arrow at the effigy of Ravana. And you start seeing these missionaries and English officials start noticing that suddenly Ravana's effigies are appearing in the clothes of the English Governor General. Because again, this isn't street protest, but it's a way of marking dissent. Very quietly, not so subtly, but it's happening. What happens is this reformation that starts under Ram Mohan Roy, etc., is that there is now a generation of Indians who are also studying English. They're also being raised in a framework that is Western, and they're aware that the West is ahead of India in many respects, technologically, militarily. That's why they've conquered India. So Ram Mohan Roy and that generation recognized that there is something amiss in Hindu society. And they, in many ways, mimic the template of Catholicism and Protestantism. The Protestant claim was that the Catholic religion was a corruption of true Christianity. True Christianity was buried by the Catholic Church under rituals, forms. It was, in fact, Protestants call it idolatry. They say Catholicism is idolatry. And that Protestant Reformation restores the original pristine form of Christianity. That's a Protestant narrative. Yeah. British rulers and the missionaries coming in are Protestant missionaries. British education system is putting out this narrative of world history, etc. In this climate, reformers like Ram Mohan Roy essentially start believing in that same argument, which is that there was once a pristine Hinduism, which was monotheistic,
Vedantic,
purely
yeah.
Vedantic, purely based on the Upanishads, not even the ritual side of the Vedas, the Upanishadic side, which is philosophical, metaphysical. That Hinduism got corrupted by Brahmins over a period of time into temple worship and idolatry, and therefore it had to be reformed, and there had to be a Hindu reformation, very much like a Protestant reformation, which is what Ram Mohan Roy ultimately attempts to do. He doesn't want temples, he doesn't want idol worship, he wants a kind of purified Vedic, Vedantic kind of Hinduism. So that impulse where even today, when we think of Vivekananda going abroad to America and giving his famous speech in the 1890s, that romanticization of Vedanta comes out of this defense mechanism where you think that good religion has to be monotheistic, has to have certain texts, has to be philosophical, has to be shorn of idolatry and worship in any of these loud, dramatic forms. And we essentially try to do that by...
So basically the British made Indians or Hindus embarrassed about the Puranic traditions and the multiple gods, and so that was seen as a lower order of being.
Among some Hindus.
Among some
There were always Hindus who resisted this claim. Even now, most Hindus are still following the Puranic system. We should always remember that. This was an intellectualized version of Hinduism to present Hinduism to the rest of the world, to the Western world primarily. But yeah.
So, you know, just coming back to, because when you read the book, it is a bit of a shock, the kind of almost violent language in which the Christian missionaries are speaking of Hinduism. And, you know, so I think that sort of difficult conversation to attempt is that the Hindu wound that the Hindutva project speaks of is real, that there is a psychological wound, there is a cultural wound, there's intellectual wound that does need healing. Now, how you vivify that healing is what I think our modern project has to do, a renaissance rather than revenge. But at that moment, there was a wound, and you talk about the Portuguese and even before the British, that there was forceful conversion, there was temple destruction. So that's one strand. Will you talk about also the Indomania that happened, So just to bring back the complexity of all this phenomenon, what did that Indomania constitute, and who was attracted to India, and why were they attracted to India?
So again, as I said, the British were also divided into multiple camps, right? There was this pro-India camp and there was the anti-India camp. There were people who didn't want missionaries and there were people who were supportive of missionaries.
Manu has a amusing description in the book where he says it's like our TV debates now, that kind of polarized infotainment was going on in the Britain of the 19th and 18th centuries over India, because it was so polarized, whether India was Moloch and hell or whether it was really the elevated spiritual space. But
so
tell us more
there was a
about
whole class of Orientalists who came into Bengal and Madras and all of these places where they were looking at Sanskrit literature, they were looking at Shakuntala, they were looking at texts on arithmetic like the Bija Ganita, and they were saying that actually Hindus have everything they need. They don't need Western civilization. In their traditions, they already have enough that we should just resurrect, revivify, and give it back to them. That's what they sort of highlighted. And it did essentially come to the aid of reformist Hindus, right? One of the reasons Hindus in the 19th century did not convert was because they were aware that their traditions had enough that could stand up to Western scrutiny, survive the worst of Western criticism, and still hold its own. So yes, there was always a group of Europeans who were doing this, but you should remember that the Hindus were also not passively absorbing this. There was always what I call a selective appropriation. You always selectively take what the West is offering or the West is sort of remolding, and then you turn it back against the West. So for instance, the Warren Hastings in the 18th century, who he was the governor of Bengal, he commissions a translation of the Bhagavad Gita. And his whole intention is to show people in Britain that, look, Hindus have holy texts. These holy texts have these very lofty ideas. They don't need Western intervention. We should govern them on their terms. And his translator has this bit saying that, the Hindus will be so grateful to us for translating the Bhagavad Gita. Very interesting, because the British forgot in this process of translation where the Bhagavad Gita is happening. It's happening in a battlefield where Arjuna is hesitating to go to war against his cousins, and Krishna is telling him, do your duty, you have to go and fight. And by the middle of the 19th century, the same Hindus are now using the Gita to stand up to the British. And there's also, all missionaries are already warning that you better be careful about romanticizing the Gita, because the Gita in the hands of Hindus can actually help them stand up to the British state. Cut to another 50 years, revolutionaries are being caught with Tilak's translation of the Gita in their pockets. The Gita is officially called by the British a manual for revolutionary training. So the Indomaniacs romanticize the Gita from their prism. Indians appropriate that romanticization and weaponize it against the Europeans or against the British who are in the country. But the other point you made, I also want to quickly address that, which is on Hindutva and that wound. It's interesting that power is very important here. If you look at the early debates the missionaries had with the Brahmins, they were not, at that time the Hindus weren't affected that much by it. For example, in Calicut in the Portuguese period, there was a missionary who went, he did his research and he told the Calicut Raja's court, your god Krishna dancing around with gopis, this is not a real god. He's a very ill-behaved god. You have Ganapati, he's got the head of an elephant, such a large paunch, and somehow he's commuting on a rat. How can this be a god? But at that time, the Brahmins are just amused, and they also counter back. They say that, well, you're saying Jesus was God's son, then if he was divine, how could he have been put up on a cross and left to die? Did God have no other way of saving the world than inflicting such pain on this man? They're answering back, their words, not mine. Then they say that, you say that we are idolaters, but you have processions for the Virgin Mary. Isn't that idolatry? So at that time, they're fine. Power is what becomes critical. And if you look at when power shifts is when it becomes a wound, when you feel that now you're under attack, because it's no longer a conversation between equals, it is a conversation between a ruling class and a ruling society and a subject society. And that's why if you look at Hindutva also, ultimately it's not really about religion. And Savarkar essentially says this much. He says it's not really about religion. It is about who has control of state power. And that is where power becomes very critical to understanding this. And the whole book is essentially about power. It's about power equations changing this whole dynamic of religion and religious identities.
But, there's so many complex strands in your book, so we won't be able to unravel all of it. But I want to talk about the Hindutva project, and that formation of, and again, it had its origins in some complex but positive impulses, like Raja Ram Mohan Roy reforming Hindu society, or Dayanand Saraswati, or Bal Gangadhar Tilak, or the 5-6 characters that you actually pick up. All of them are motivated by this encounter with Christian missionaries and the Colonial project. There's some positive aspects of it, but it then also it morphs into a kind of hatred of Muslims, and bizarrely more of Muslims than of Christians, So one, help us understand that why is there a greater hatred of Muslims than of Christians out of that reaction? And number two is that Ashish Nandi very well put it, that when you're colonized or when your psyche is hurt, then your response becomes framed. Your entire worldview is then framed by those who wounded you, And so the Hindutva project is also born out of this wound. So help us understand these two things, how did the Hindutva project respond within the framework of colonialism, and why does it end up demonizing Muslims more than Christians?
So that's the interesting thing, right? For the longest time, you see that the big feared element is the Christian missionary, and that animosity is what's triggering this sense of Hinduness as a political identity. Hindus are coalescing around this political identity in order to resist. Ram Mohan Roy frames an intellectual defense of Hinduism. Dayananda Saraswati inaugurates a muscular kind of mass mobilization of Hindus through cow protection and such things on the ground. It's not just intellectual, it's movement on the ground. But there's also critique within Hinduism calling for reform by people like Mahatma Phule. They want Hindus within to dismantle oppressive systems. Already in that, as I said, Ram Mohan Roy has appropriated that Protestant framework. Phule, in fact, in criticizing traditional Brahmanism, appropriates the language of the missionary. He also lampoons Hindu gods. He also lampoons the Puranic tradition because he wants to hold up a mirror to Hindus. So he's again weaponizing the language of the missionary for his own purposes. So you see that several of them are operating on terms very much, as you alluded to, set by somebody else. But again, they're weaponizing it for themselves. They're not passively doing it. They still have agency. The Muslim becomes important because although it is in this Christian missionary kind of context that the Hindu political identity is born, with the coming of the censuses, with the coming of counting of people in the 19th century, a new framework is also born. Earlier people lived in villages, nobody really knew how many numbers of Brahmins were there and how many Kshatriyas were there or how many Marathas were there and how many Dalits were there. Nobody was sitting and counting these things. These things just existed. But the moment you start counting, and the British created these two master legal categories, right? Everybody who was not a Muslim was essentially lumped on the Hindu side, and then the Muslims were lumped onto this side. Even though there were Muslims who worshipped Hindu gods, and there were Hindus who went to Muslim shrines. Both of these things existed. And once you create this sense of a majority and a minority, that's when a new mischief was created. Suddenly, Muslim leaders started panicking that, oh, if we're a minority, we will be treated in a poor way. Therefore, we have to argue that there are two nations in this country, and therefore, that sort of equalizes it. If you're talking purely about communities, then there's a majority and a minority. If you're talking about two nations, then it's slightly more equal. One nation has as much right as the other to exist. So they bring up that argument. The majority community or the Hindus are now aware of their sense of majority. They are now paranoid about conversion to Christianity as well as Islam because they feel their sense of numbers, their strength in numbers will reduce. And therefore that becomes a new anxiety, how to maintain numbers. So the Arya Samaj under Dayananda Saraswati eventually creates reconversion. So this is what I find, again, a parallel with missionaries. Just as in the Portuguese period, Francis Xavier could go converting whole villages and say that sometimes his hands hurt because he had converted hundreds and thousands of people in a very short space of time. The Arya Samaj starts doing the reverse, reconverting people back to Hinduism from Islam and Christianity to shore up numbers. In Travancore, the Temple Entry Proclamation of 1936, allowing Dalits to come into temples, happens not because the Maharaja's woken up one fine morning and felt sympathetic towards Dalits. It's because Dalits are converting to Christianity or Islam, and he's paranoid. So numbers is where the fear of the Muslim becomes real as opposed to the missionary, even though it is Christianity that triggers that initial impulse to defend Hinduism and assert a muscular Hindu identity.
So Manu, I'll urge everyone to read the book to understand, as I said, how complex this whole tapestry, all the social, political, cultural, emotional, collisions that are happening. But my final question to you would be, in understanding the origins of the Hindutva movement in that, where do you think how should that understanding inflect our modern times? There is a kind of legitimacy of sort of social context in which this grows, and it's a response to something which is quite violent and vile at times. So how should your book stops and does not come into modern India? If we understand, and as I said, we're increasingly trying to create the space where we can understand the complexity of all this, and it's not, like Suvir said, woke liberalism versus fanatic nationalism and everyone hating each other, calling each other names. Your scholarship, Vikram Sampa's just written about Tipu Sultan. It helps you look history in the eye. But what should we do with that understanding in our modern time? How would you rephrase or engage with the Hindutva project now, having done this book?
Again, nothing comes out of thin air, right? So one of the reasons I wrote this book was to answer some questions I myself had. I think it's simplistic to assume that Savarkar woke up one fine morning, wrote a book on Hindutva, and that's how Hindutva emerged. If you look at the actual material, Tilak was trying to define Hindutva, or Hinduness, as they called it. Before that, also, there were people trying to find a way to answer the question, what makes Hindus Hindu in a political sense? What makes them a political bloc? What unites them? Savarkar merely gives it its most enduring, compelling, theoretically lasting answer. But before him also, there were people doing this. There's a scholar called Rahul Sarvate who's written about this. And if you look at Maharashtra alone, this question around how to define Hinduness was floating around for a while. So Savarkar did not emerge in a vacuum. Similarly, that sense of grievance, that sense of historical grievance, I think, while it is exaggerated, I mean, I write in the book itself that if you look at Savarkar, some of his other books, it's almost as if throughout history there's only been religious clash. That's also an exaggeration. It's much more complicated than that. But all the same, it is true that there is a sense of grievance that comes out of a sense of being under siege. And that colonialism, rule by foreigners, etc., has definitely contributed to. The danger, as you said, is that these things today can be used to vilify present-day communities in our country, and that is not something anybody should support, I think, at least in the framework that we've all accepted as a society in our constitution, etc. We've decided categorically not to do that, and we should stick by our principles. But at the same time, we can't keep brushing inconvenient things under the carpet. Sometimes, as you said, looking it in the eye, acknowledging that the past is complicated. The past has sides that are not going to please us. The past has sides that is going to make us very uncomfortable. But that's fine. So what? It happened several centuries ago. We've moved on. If there's any lesson you can draw from history, it is that we should try and move on from some of these festering sores instead of trying to pick at them again and again. So while I acknowledge that, yes, Hindutva emerged because of certain historical processes, etc., I don't think the exaggerated version of it, which is that, this is a country only for one set of people or one group of people, I don't think that will fly either. So this is just my way of trying to understand where that impulse comes from. How we negotiate it now and in future is for us to decide as a people.
Thank you very, very much, Manu. And, again, your book, as I said earlier, when he wrote of the Deccan, it was so cosmopolitan. There were Ethiopians, there were Iranians, there were Persians, there was, all kinds of Africans and Romans. Now taking another leaf out of William Dalrymple's book, that Ajanta cave in 250 BC talks about just how vivid Indian society was, because you see all these varieties of people and trade and ideas. And so if we are to have a Hindu renaissance, as I keep saying, it should be a renaissance rather than a revenge.
I'm glad that image came up last, because if you read the book, read up this man called Sarfoji of Tanjore. He represented a Hindu renaissance that was confident, that was not afraid of outside cultures. He was a Hindu Raja, he funded his Vedic Pathashalas, went to temples, all of that, but he also promoted modern science, he translated scientific material into Indian languages, because he was a confident kind of Hindu. I think a lot of today's animosities and fears come out of insecurity, and I don't think we need that insecurity. There's a way to do the Hindu identity with confidence and with grace and with magnanimity, and not this kind of defensive, festering kind of thing that we see largely around us.
Thank you very, very much, Manu. His book is being sold there, and he's happy to sign books. So thank you very much, all of you. Thank you, Manu.
Thank you for listening. Thank you.